All right, welcome. We're living through a time that will be taught in history classes for a very, very long time as one of the worst and most uncertain periods in American history. And you can make the argument we've been living through that period for the past 4 years. But certainly over the last 8 days, we've stumbled onto some unprecedented and previously unexplored ground to be avoided. So that's what we'll talk about today. We're going to start with Philip Bump, correspondent for The Washington Post, based in New York. He's been with us before. Carlos Lozada, one of his colleagues at The Washington Post, is a Pulitzer Prize winner who he didn't read every Trump book because no one can do that, but he read about 150 of them. And he has an amazing new book out about that. Much of what we're going through right now was quite predictable from the very beginning. I think you probably know that anyway. And then Jeannie Suk Gersen is a contributing writer to The New Yorker, professor at Harvard Law School. She'll be our final guest here today. But Philip Bump, welcome back to our show.
Thank you very much.
I'm going to ask you a question that maybe is an unfair burden to put on you, but it was asked of me last night. And I was asked by my former wife on the phone, who I'm very close with. She said, basically she said, is this going to be okay? Is it going to be the case that ultimately that there will be a seating of the appropriate electors, that they will cast their electoral votes appropriately, and that Joe Biden will be sworn in January? And I said yes. I just said too many people with too much at risk in terms just reputationally and maybe even existentially would have to jump on too many live grenades for this to go otherwise. It would just take too much of a kind of tilting of the game board so that all the pieces left where they should be and slid down to the other end. But did I give the right answer? That's my inappropriate question for you.
Yeah, I would say that yes, with about 14 asterisks, you gave the right answer. The asterisks are, among the asterisks, I should say, are the following. The first is that reliance upon existing structures and norms and understandings, particularly among Republican leaders, was not successful in preventing Donald Trump from becoming the Republican Party nominee in 2016 and then the president, right? Not necessarily that it should have been, but it certainly was the case the Republican establishment thought that it had a way to contain Trump, which ended up not working. Now, of course, that same sense, well, yeah, we'll let him sort of mess around with this for a while, and then reality will bring him to heel. Obviously, now it's a lot more complicated, particularly as he gins up this, think of it as sort of a flywheel of nonsense that he's got spinning on Fox News and in the conservative media and broadly among his supporters who believe his allegations, his totally unfounded allegations about rampant fraud and how Joe Biden is illegitimate. There's a poll I wrote about this morning from YouGov and The Economist. 86% of Trump voters actually think that Biden's not a legitimate president. So there's a lot of momentum spinning in the direction of Trump making these arguments and a track record of Republican establishment figures not being able to stop that. Now, granted, an election is very different than what would be required, particularly from the courts, in order to have the direction of this thing change significantly, which is why I think that, yes, you're right in saying that. But I don't think that it's something we can take for granted. And I'll also say that even assuming that things progress as expected and Biden is inaugurated on January 20th, which, again, is the fair assumption to make, that doesn't mean that there's not been incalculable damage done to the democratic process in the United States, which I think is absolutely the case.
Yeah, there's just no question that there's harm and that it will be difficult to repair kind of harm. So, when I get to my conversation with Mr. Lozada, one of the books that I can ask him about is Daniel Drezner's book, Toddler in Chief, in which each chapter is preceded by a quote from one of those, books on how to raise baby, basically an uncooperative tantrum-throwing toddler. And you've written a piece basically saying, are we going to reject democratic elections to soothe Trump's ego? In Woodward's books, we see Gary Cohn taking stuff off of his desk so he can't act on it. We see Kelly and Tillerson talking about, well, would we have to tackle him at some point? And it seems as though the herd of that kind of person, the kind of person who might subtly or not so subtly sort of step in front of the president and say, no, that's a bridge too far. You really can't go that far. He's basically gotten rid of those people or they've quit. And it does seem as though the people who are left are more likely at least to kind of nominally say, oh, yeah, no, we can do that. We can try to overturn 4 different elections in 4 different states. Maybe you could say a little more about that.
No, I think you're right that President Trump has been pretty aggressive over the course of the past couple of years of weeding out folks who might offer him a contrary opinion. He's more so than past presidents, isolated in a very sycophantic bubble, and has been for some time now. I mean, we hear these news reports about people who are close to the president or within the White House saying, "Well, we all sort of acknowledge that he's going to lose this thing. We just sort of we got to let him take his time and come to that realization." That those people aren't willing to say so publicly, of course, is concerning. That so many other Republicans in D.C. are at least willing to pay lip service to Donald Trump's claims, including Senate Majority Mitch McConnell, is also problematic. At some point in time, there will be an end to it. Right. I mean, there was an end to it in 2000 when the Supreme Court ultimately had to weigh in and determined which direction the results in Florida were going to go. And that was actually a close race in one state that made all the difference, not a not close race in 4 states. So it's likely that the end will come sooner than that they will run out of legal avenues, assuming they don't just keep filing frivolous lawsuits to try and keep things floating up in the air. So there will be at some point an authority which says, look, guys, you're done. There's a drop dead date, essentially, of December 8th, in which the states have to finalize their slates of electors. By that time, and that's sort of what McConnell pointed to yesterday, well, that's the time at which this thing will be resolved, which obviously is not the way it normally works. But there will at some point be an outside force. A body in motion will at some point run into an unstoppable object. But it doesn't seem as though that's going to come from within Donald Trump's administration.
Right. And I think you and I both agree that this is really not very much like 2000. 2000 came down to 1 state and just a few hundred votes in that one state. And even so, ultimately, Al Gore, not having expended every single possible move he could make, made a decision, that it was time to lay down his cards and to accept defeat. So you have a guy like Gore who could accept defeat even with right in his face, a very, very narrow margin. And now you have a guy who can't accept defeat, even though he's losing, pretty much. I mean, he's losing catastrophically. I mean, nobody has him with more than 217 electoral votes right now, and he's losing by tens of thousands of votes in these states that aren't finalized. I mean, this is a very different scenario both ways. It's a more extreme victory for Biden and a completely less magnanimous, to put it mildly, president. So, I mean, what do we do with that?
I mean, I was ready to respond until you said, "What do we do with that?" Which I don't know the answer.
Forget I asked you that. That was
but I mean, it's important to point out that Donald Trump tried to establish this election in advance in 2 ways. First, by claiming that mail-in ballots were likely to be subject to fraud, which was never true, and he never had evidence to support that claim. But then secondarily, by suggesting that this is the sort of close election that would come down to the courts, which was absolutely an exceptional moment in 2000. It was not a norm. It was not the case that the Supreme Court normally weighed in on these things. It was absolutely an exception. And the Supreme Court itself noted that it was acting exceptionally in what it did that year. However you think about it, it sort of set that boundary. Al Gore at the time was not just contesting a Florida result, which had him down by mere hundreds of votes, unlike, as you point out, Trump's at least 5-digit deficits in all the states where he trails. But he was also the popular vote leader, right? I mean, Al Gore had 500,000 more votes than did George W. Bush. So it was also not the case that he was operating from a position of weakness in that regard. It was clear that Americans preferred to have him as president, but because of the electoral college system, he wasn't able to prevail. Now, of course, Trump trails by 5 million votes, 10 times as many votes as did Gore or as did Bush. And, that gap is widening every day as more votes come in from New York and Illinois and California. So there is no position in which Trump is comparable to where George W. Bush was. His arguments are far, far weaker. I mean, to the point that, in the same way that I'm, weaker than a professional weightlifter, right? I mean, there's just no comparison between the two. And even if he got a swing of 1,000 votes somewhere, which would be more than enough in Florida, it doesn't make a dent in any of the places that he trails now. So there simply is no comparison between the two. And Donald Trump has lost far more decisively than did Al Gore 20 years ago.
Yeah, and this is something I'll probably get into with my third guest, but that whole idea, when you name in advance all the deficiencies that you think you see, the flaws that you think you see before the election, but don't take any action, it actually creates a legal disadvantage for yourself. There's a term called lashes, where you can't sue after you've lost an election about stuff you knew about beforehand.
Right.
So he's actually put himself in a bad position that way. I want to just quickly, while we have you, just talk a little bit about another thing that you've written about, which is the State Department. The State Department, basically, as it looks around the world, decade after decade, is really interested in peaceful transfers of power. That's a good sign when we look at it in other countries. And yet our Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, well, Kat, let's just play the clip here. He said the following.
There will be a smooth transition to a second Trump administration. All right, we're ready. The world is watching what's taking place here. We're going to count all the votes. When the process is complete, there'll be electors selected. There's a process. The Constitution lays it out pretty clearly. The world should have every confidence that the transition necessary to make sure that the State Department is functional today, successful today, and successful with the president who's in office on January 20th, a minute afternoon, will also be successful.
So, that statement kind of has two different parts to it. And the first part kind of slightly invalidates the second part, right? I mean, right. He says all the right things kind of towards the end there. But maybe you can expand on this and how it kind of contrasts with typically what the State Department has as a value.
Well, I think one of the things we've seen over the course of the past 4 years is that the United States' longstanding institutional advocacy for systems like democratic processes and certain international behaviors has been undermined by actions taken by the Trump administration. I went back through yesterday actually and pulled out a number of examples just from the Trump administration in which we've praised the election results in Burundi and the Democratic Republic of Congo and the Seychelles and all these various places where we talk about how they transition to a democratic election is beneficial to that country and how respecting the transfer of power is a sign of governmental health and the body politic. The government says this a lot. It is obviously uncommon for a Secretary of State then to stand up and reject the obvious results of one of America's own elections. He tried to sort of chuckle after having said that. It may be the case that it was an extremely ill-timed joke, but this is one of the most senior officials in Donald Trump's cabinet keeping the door cracked for this claim that somehow perhaps Trump is actually the winner of the election, which is flatly not true, and doing so because he obviously thinks that he is someone who might end up on the 2024 Republican nominating ticket and wants to maintain a positive relationship with Trump's extremely fervent base, which again has bought into this idea that he somehow actually won the election.
So let me ask you two more quick questions. I know you're busy. I don't want to take up too much of your time here. One of them is, as we look towards Mitch McConnell and other Republican leaders, it's hard to sort of tease out the difference between whatever allegiance to or necessary placating of Donald Trump they feel they have to do versus what's going to happen in Georgia when the runoff comes. They still haven't solidified or nailed down their majority in the Senate. There might be some reason why McConnell and others would want to charge up the base, make sure people show out to vote in Georgia, that the Republican Party outperforms what it did on November 3rd. I don't know. Do you get any sense as you talk to people, as you interview people, sort of whether there's a little bit more of that and a little bit less of let's keep the toddler happy?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of hard to balance. There are a lot of motivations for people to go along with what Trump is doing right now, right? Part of it certainly is that Donald Trump's going to be very mad at people who buck him. And, for a general run-of-the-mill Republican elected official, there's not a lot of value in being the target of getting dumped on by Donald Trump on Twitter, right? There's just not a lot of value to it, beyond obviously standing up for what's right. But, that's sort of secondary to having a bad Twitter feed for a day, I guess. But there are other reasons that they might want to do it, including that a lot of these campaigns and candidates are using it to fundraise. After a campaign is done, candidates often have debt that they need to retire. Newt Gingrich still has debt from his 2012 presidential race that he needs to pay off. And so these candidates are raising money. And if you look at the fine print, most of the money goes to retiring campaign debt, including in Donald Trump's case. He's, at first was explicit about it. Now he's sort of pushing all of his money into a PAC that can be used to pay off campaign debt. People are energized about it. And if people are energized, then people are writing checks. And if people are writing checks, then you can pay off your debt. And so that's a motivation as well. But it is also the case, as you point out, that there is this hotly contested set of races really in Georgia coming up in early January, which will determine the makeup of the Senate. And Republicans need to win that. And Republicans, in order to win that, have to have an energized Republican base, which they didn't have to the same extent in 2018 that they did in 2020. An off-year election like that, a special runoff election, is necessarily going to depress turnout, particularly from people who only come out to vote because they like Donald Trump. And they need to keep those people ginned up. And so Mitch McConnell doesn't want to say, okay, yeah, right, let's move on to President Joe Biden, because he wants to keep those people energized and active and perhaps, donating to those Senate campaigns as well.
All right. Well, Philip Bump, we know that these are busy times for you, so you're so gracious to spend some of that time with us, correspondent for the Washington Post based in New York. Thank you so much for doing this today.
Of course, my pleasure.
All right, we're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk to the guy. He's got to be the guy who's read more Trump and Trump-adjacent books than any human being, or than is good for any human being. Carlos Lozada joins us.
Just give me some truth. I've had enough of reading things by neurotic, psychotic, big-headed politicians. All I want is the truth. Just give me some truth.
All right, so earlier today, as just a little experiment, I pulled out all of the books that I could find in my house that are Trump books and Trump-adjacent books. These are almost inevitably people who've appeared on the show. And there were a lot of them, and I know it's not all of them because I couldn't find the Ponowozik book, and I couldn't find the Mark Fisher book, and there's a whole bunch of books that I couldn't find. But there's still a lot of them. And ironically, I can add to the pile, so to speak, this terrific new book by Carlos Lozada, the nonfiction book critic of the Washington Post. He won the Pulitzer Prize for criticism in 2019, and he is the author of What Were We Thinking? A Brief Intellectual History of the Trump Era. So, Carlos Lozada, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So, I just maybe before we begin, I think it's important to introduce you to the listeners. So maybe we should just begin by talking about the fact that 2016 was the first American presidential election in which you voted. Explain why that is.
Yes, I'm originally from Lima, Peru. I came here as a child, but I didn't become a U.S. citizen until late 2014. And so I just missed the chance to vote in those midterms. So 2016 was my first experience as a voter.
So was there a particular, I'm sure you get to ask this all the time, a particular impulse that started you down this road of reading these Trump? They're not all books specifically about Trump. We should say some of them are specifically about what you refer to as Heartlandia. These are the kind of hillbilly elegy kinds of books about the putative Trump voter. But what got you going on all this?
Mm-hmm. I think if you told me up front what the exercise would be, I might not have started down that road, but it sort of happened accidentally. I had just become the book critic at the Washington Post in 2015, just a few months before Trump announced his candidacy. And so I started reading some of his books once he was doing so well in the polls for the nomination. And then later on, as people were trying to understand where his support came from, I started reading all these books that were coming out about the white working class. Then he won the election, and suddenly there were all these resistance volumes that I had to read. And that's when I realized this is my beat. This is what I'm going to be doing in this job, that all these debates that would emerge from the Trump presidency were going to be in some way litigated through books. And so I really haven't stopped since.
Right. And litigated through books is a really interesting phrase because in a way, as this whole thing got started, some of us went back to Hannah Arendt or to the work of Richard Hofstadter, which seems so incredibly predictive of some of the stuff that's going on right now, or Neil Postman, who really, way, way early in the game got that whole idea of politics and entertainment bleeding into each other to a point of being indistinguishable at times. And now these books, it's kind of an oddity, right, that so many books are coming out in a way that's coterminous with the presidency they're trying to be about. I mean, usually I think of these things as taking, minimum 18 months after the departure of the executive before you'd see these flood tides of books.
Yes, I remember back in the 90s, I was just out of college, and it was so almost scandalous that someone like George Stephanopoulos would write a memoir of his time in the Clinton White House. Before Clinton had left office, it seemed like this sort of impossible thing. And now, of course, people have been departing the White House and heading straight to the literary agency, to sign book deals. So there has been an inordinate amount of books coming out about Trump. Someone estimated that there were about 1,200 books in the first, 3+ years of the Trump presidency, compared to about 400 in the equivalent period of the Obama presidency. But I think you're right that initially people started looking back. I mean, it was such a shock to so many, including to Trump supporters and to the Trump team itself, that he won, that people started looking at some of the books you mentioned, but also sort of dystopian fiction. 1984 shot to the top of bestseller lists. But quickly these books began to emerge, in part because of the constant churn in the Trump administration that a lot of officials left. But just people started weighing in, journalists, academics, and other people bringing their expertise to bear.
And I mean, it's an irresistible impulse, but one wonders whether this is a good way to try to understand. It's like trying to write about a train while you're running next to it. It's a lot of times I think history reveals itself to us as history when it is history, as opposed to trying to write history about something that's happening. I don't know. Is it a good method is what I'm asking.
That's a really good question. I think that there have been some terrific books to come out of this period. I think that in some ways the best books, the most essential books, are not the ones that deal explicitly with Trump himself, but with how the country got to this point. In some ways, Trump revealed as much as he really shifted. But I do expect that some of the best books of the Trump era have yet to be written. I mean, we're still waiting for Robert Caro's latest volume on LBJ, right? These histories take a long, long time, and we're going to keep learning about this time for many years, even in a post-Trump era. I don't anticipate that the glut of Trump books will slow down too significantly.
So, as I said at the beginning, I got a lot of these books in my house too, and I've interviewed a lot of these people. That notwithstanding, there were some books that you wrote about that I didn't know about, and I'm intrigued by. One of them is the authors are Levitsky and Zyblatt, if I'm saying that name right. Mm-hmm. This is a book. Well, you should describe the book, not me.
Sure. These are two Harvard political scientists who are experts on democracy and democratic breakdowns around the world. And like many democracy experts, they have usually spent their academic careers writing about other countries. Not really anticipating that these fears and issues could come to the fore in the United States. Their book is called How Democracies Die, and they highlight two essential norms that underpin democracy in the United States. And it's something that many of us have come to understand during this period, that democracy is not always about formal rules and laws, but just about mutually understood behavior, about norms. And the two norms that they highlight are mutual respect, that is the understanding that you are in an ongoing sort of repeated game and battle with the opposing party, but that you're both playing the same game, that it's not that one doesn't pose an existential threat to the other. And yet that's a norm that we violated, because I think we live in such a polarized country that often the sides see themselves as existential threats. And the other norm that they highlight is what they call forbearance, which is just this very simple notion that simply because you can do something doesn't mean that you should do something. And right now, what you see and what you've seen over the past 4 years, especially on the side of the president, is this notion that, well, I can do this. I can fire the FBI director, and simply because you have the technical ability to do something doesn't make it a good idea.
The other thing that you highlighted from that book that I think is very, very apt right now is, particularly, I was just talking to your colleague Phil Bump about Mitch McConnell, that idea of party leaders who are working with a not necessarily stable or rational chief executive, and in order to get things that they want, they accommodate. They write that party leaders risk becoming the thing they thought they were accommodating. And I think that seems very apt right now. There's a way in which, like the lobster in the pot, the temperature is being turned up more slowly and more slowly and more slowly. And maybe a guy like McConnell, who basically thought Trump would be useful to him if he could handle him just the right way, has underestimated the degree he has become the thing he thought he could control.
Throughout Mitch McConnell's career, he's been interested in, maybe not above all else, but certainly up there is judicial appointments, right? And in that respect, the Trump administration has been entirely useful to him. The parties in the past were thought of as gatekeepers, as party leaders would somehow prevent fringe or extreme candidates and forces from gaining too much prominence, winning elections, and overtaking the political system. That is a function that certainly on the right seems to have largely disappeared in this context. Trump is the sort of leader that if the parties had fulfilled that function, would have been marginalized, and would have, instead you would have had sort of, Marco Rubio or Jeb Bush or some of these conventional candidates. If you look in the past at Mitt Romney, at John McCain, these are the kind of candidates that emerged. But the party sort of helped stoke the kind of more vociferous Republican base, and then finally realized it had lost control. And there was a famous book a few years ago that was called "The Party Decides," that shows how party leadership selects these candidates. But now the party has basically not decided but submitted.
So the other book I wanted to ask you about, because I didn't know this book, and boy, once again, the stuff that you comment on from it just seems aimed right at the moment now, is called "A Lot of People Are Saying," which is a great title, by Muirhead and Rosenbaum. Once again, give people just a quick sketch of it.
Yes, that's you notice that so many of the titles of books of the Trump era, draw from his own words, right? Fire and Fury, American Carnage, A Very Stable Genius, and this was maybe my favorite. A Lot of People Are Saying, because it's something that Trump says a lot when he's floating conspiracy theories. And that's what this book is about. Conspiratorial thinking has been at the core of Trump's campaigning and governing strategy, starting with birtherism, but then he even questioned the legitimacy of an election that he won in 2016 when he said that there were millions of illegal votes. And we're back at conspiratorial thinking about elections now in 2020. What Muirhead and Rosenblum argue is that there's something distinct about this particular brand of conspiracism that Trump peddles. Conspiracies are usually very intricate. If you talk to a 9/11 truther, suddenly you're talking about the temperature at which different metals dissolve and all this. There's painstaking detail. Trump's conspiracies are incredibly uncomplicated. They're just one word repetitions, rigged, hoax, fake, over and over again until they stick. And what happens next, which is particularly insidious in the author's view, is that Trump retroactively enlists the institutions of government to try to justify those beliefs. And, there were a ton of books about truth in this period. A lot of people were saying, which was a sort of small academic book by a university press, kind of slipped under the radar, but to me was a very useful book to understand conspiratorial thinking.
So, one of the things that I thought while reading your book is that there's a way in which at a certain point we started to habituate to a certain kind of revelation. It's like Valium. You take a Valium every day and pretty soon you need 2 Valium to get the same effect from the first Valium. And there's a way in which, by the time Rucker and Lenig had their book, A Very Stable Genius, come out, and there's stuff in there about maybe Trump didn't really understand what Pearl Harbor was. And you read that and you think, well, that's pretty bad, but it's sort of like I've taken that Valium before. I know that one. And then by the time Woodward comes out with his second book, there's a scene in that book that no one has ever commented about, where they're trying to explain the Korean situation to him and the American investment in Korea versus the military presence of South Korea itself. And they do it with gumballs. And I'm reading this and I'm thinking, if this book had come out I don't know if you remember that part, but if it come out in 2017, everybody, gumballs would be a thing. It would be a meme that people talked about.
Right.
And it just didn't make any impression on anybody at all, because I think we've kind of gotten habituated to a lot of this stuff. And I think it also might help explain why people really wanted the hard stuff. They wanted the Mary Trump book, when that was coming out, the people, the junkies who were just not getting high anymore on he doesn't know what Pearl Harbor is. They wanted to know what Mary had to say. And I just wonder if you have any thoughts about that process. I mean, there's been such a surfeit of this stuff that I'm wondering whether it makes the impact it should.
I think you're absolutely right. I think we've gotten to a point where so many things about the Trump presidency were shocking, yet no longer surprising, right? You could believe almost any of these stories because they fit into what we were seeing with our own eyes. And in terms of these books, it really began with Fire and Fury by Michael Wolff, which came out in early 2018 and was the first big blockbuster, sensation Trump book that gave you all these bizarre insider details and stories. And ever since then, I feel that some of these books, I have a chapter in my book that I dedicate to all these books. I call them the Chaos Chronicles, because it's like they're almost competing for just, who can have the craziest, oh my God, story. And part of that is also about the way we read them. I think that some of these books have excellent reporting that also uncover other significant details that we need to know. I mean, Woodward's book, Rage, received so much attention in part for these conversations that the reporter had with President Trump that make up the second half of the book. The first half of the book is precisely about national security officials and their major concerns over a potential war with North Korea, right? If you read A Very Stable Genius, it's something similar. The things that are memorable or most memorable are, there was a moment when Trump was reading the Constitution and was literally stumbling over the words like he didn't understand them, which is metaphor alert, right? But there's other moments in that book that to me were far more significant. Like when I learned that Robert Mueller's team had, after completing their report, passed up the chance to review the Attorney General William Barr's letter that was going to characterize and frankly mischaracterize that report for the public. In hindsight, I bet they wish that they had taken a look. And I think sometimes we forget those other more essential parts of this narrative in favor of the shocking yet not surprising details about Trump day to day.
Right. It's a horrible thing to quote one book critic to another book critic, and hopefully you guys didn't like have a fist fight at a book critic circle luncheon one day. But Dwight Garner had a line where he said, he talked about these insiders. He's talking specifically about Josh Powell's book, Inside the NRA. He says, now he's a singing insider in the year of the singing insider, a misfit chorus performing a cappella around a trash can fire. And I did feel as though I've read enough of those books, and I think you're right. They're trying to outdo each other too. And sometimes it's the smaller thing, the smaller observation, the slightly more nuanced observation. It's one that you cite from the Wittes Hennessy book, which I also have, and we did a show with them too. But anyway, a staffer named Erica Newland, who talks about how she would occasionally have to kind of re-engineer, like Trump would do something abrupt and not part of the plan and go off script, and part of her job would be to kind of re-engineer the recent history so it didn't seem so crazy. It would look like it kind of made sense. She found out that this was a practice dating back to The Apprentice, when he would fire somebody he wasn't supposed to fire, and then the producers would have to go back through the old footage to see if they could kind of set this up, that this person was getting fired instead of the person that they had kind of been leading up to getting fired. And to me, that kind of detail is more interesting, because I think it's happening also right now with other staffers, than telling me just about some time when he metaphorically pooped his pants.
I think that a book by James Poniwazik called Audience of One.
We had him on too.
Yes, that did a very good job of explaining that dynamic that you outlined with The Apprentice. Except, of course, it's one thing when you're the host of The Apprentice, another thing when you are the head of the executive branch. And Trump has been, from the very beginning, enlisting the institutions of government to clean up his mistakes and advance his conspiracies. And we saw that the very first weekend when he was upset that the crowd at his inauguration was smaller than it had been at Obama's inauguration. And, he sends out the press secretary of the White House to make the case. They start, haranguing the National Park Service to come up with different photos. And that seemed like a small, silly thing, but I think it really set the tone. And you came to see it recur throughout the presidency. The power of a book like Poniwazik's is that it establishes a framework which then you see repeated in multiple ways, just watching the administration in action. And that was sort of the Apprentice writ large.
Yeah, I mean, I feel as though that and I think I said this to Poniwazik, that, The Apprentice being reality television, part of the fantasy of reality television is that you can get rid of people, right? That's pretty much what happens on The Bachelor and The Bachelorette and The Survivor and all of these things. It's an elimination game where every week you get rid of somebody, which is not, in fact, what you can do in real life. For the most part, you can't get rid of people all that easily. If they're in your family, you still have to, spend holidays with them. And if they're your coworkers, you can't just make them go away. And I do think that Trump sold the fantasy to the American public. You know what? There's people you don't like. We'll just get rid of them. And he's done that. I mean, he's gotten rid of all kinds of people, including people that he hired in the first place. But I think that he's kind of carried that narrative over, right? That there's a fantasy that, that you don't like somebody, you can make them go away. I think when we write about stuff like this, we say, well, this is chaos. This is horrible. He hasn't had a Secretary of State last for more than X number, or he hasn't, he fired the last 4 chiefs of staff that he had. But his fans are going, yeah, that's what he does, right? That's why we like him so much.
And what's interesting about that is that, he governs as if he's not, like, it's strange in that he both sort of claims almost this kind of absolute power, yet also governs as if he's not in power at all, as if he's in the opposition, as his rhetoric shows. So he's still, he's cleaning out the elites and doing all this stuff when, like, he's been running the government for 4 years. And it's just an unusual sort of game that has persisted throughout the presidency. I think that the reality TV framework is useful in part because, as I believe Hani Wazik writes, part of the appeal of reality TV is sort of being in on the joke, being in on the deception, like realize that you're being manipulated, but feel kind of smart because you get it. And I think that's what you see with, these tens of thousands of deceptions and misleading statements and outright lies that fact checkers have chronicled. It's not that they're always believed. It's that you're in on the joke, is that he's making it on your behalf. If you're one of his supporters, and it becomes not a marker of conviction, but a marker of allegiance to believe Trump's deceptions.
Well, to that point about being kind of a permanent outsider, he's currently trying to stage a coup d'etat, and he's the president, which is not how those things usually work. Anyway, Carlos Lozada, nonfiction book critic of the Washington Post, Pulitzer Prize winner, the author of What Were We Thinking? A Brief Intellectual History of the Trump Era. This has been so much fun. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for having me.
All right, we'll take a break. We'll come back, and we're going to bear down a little bit on the very specific legal questions facing us in the days and weeks ahead.
I'm writing about the book I read. I have to sing about the book I read. I'm embarrassed to admit it. Hit the soft spot in my heart when I found out you wrote the book I read. So take my shoulders and put your arms around.
All right, man, we need an extra 30 minutes for the show today. I want to thank Kat Pastor. She's there in the studio making it possible for me to be elsewhere, at home specifically, and to Jonathan McPants, the producer of this episode. So in our final segment here, we do want to talk very specifically about what's going to be happening or not happening in the courts, and we're going to do that with Jeannie Suk Gersen, a contributing writer to The New Yorker and a professor at Harvard Law School. Welcome to our conversation.
Thank you for having me.
So, it has seemed in the last few days as though the Trump campaign and some of its affiliates have been using the American legal system kind of like a slot machine. They just kind of keep pulling the lever, hoping three cherries are going to come up somewhere. And it often seems that there isn't really a specific theory of the case in some of the lawsuits that they filed. I think in one case they neglected to specify a remedy. In another case, I think in Michigan they may have filed in the wrong court. But there's just kind of this frantic scramble to find something that will get some kind of traction legally. Is there more going on than what meets the eye here?
There may well be, in that while you're right that each of the lawsuits themselves on their own can look pretty silly, the aggregate effect of all of them, if there is a method to the madness, and that's a big if there is a method, then the aggregate effect of all of them may convince enough people that where there's smoke, there's fire, that there's so many lawsuits and there's so many different things and so many different claims that they're trotting out. And so maybe in the end, it will just kind of create a sort of dust cloud of suggestion that there was a problem. There was some problem. Don't know what specific problem, but some problem.
So one of the questions that has arisen, and President Trump kind of talked about this as though it were a fairly easy thing to do. He at some point basically said, well, I'm going to go to the Supreme Court about this. And if you look back to 2000, this came up earlier in the show, the Supreme Court at that time said, this is a one-time thing. This is not a precedent, and we don't want to do this anymore. We don't want to get in the habit of deciding elections or doing anything like that. So maybe you could just say a little bit more about whether the Supreme Court would be willing to hear one of these cases, especially in an environment where, there's at minimum 4 states on the board here. All the margins are in 5 figures. Their incentive to hear a case, I would think, would be somewhat low.
I think it's a complicated question. I think Bush v. Gore, many people have taken the statement in Bush v. Gore that this is very limited to the circumstances here to mean this isn't precedential, but that is not what the case actually said. And so that would be weird for a Supreme Court case to just simply be non-precedential. Mm-hmm. So it is likely to still play a part in whatever the Supreme Court is going to do, whether to hear a case or not hear a case. So in terms of whether they're likely to hear any of the challenges going on right now, well, it's right now the only one that looks very, that looks plausible, not likely, but plausible, is the one about the Pennsylvania ballots that came in after Election Day. And that's a litigation that started before Election Day. And even though right now it looks like Pennsylvania will go to Biden, regardless of what those ballots say, the ones that came in Election Day are not going to make a difference in the vote margin. But it's still an issue. The legal issue underlying it is whether the state legislature can alter, whether a state court can alter the state legislature's deadline for receipt of ballots. And that is an issue that many people may feel will recur in future elections. So even if it's not about this election, it's possible that this term, at some point, the Supreme Court would decide to hear that case. Now, it becomes less and less likely that they'll decide the case, given that it won't make a difference in this presidential election. But on the other hand, they might be thinking, well, maybe that's the ideal time to decide a case like this when we know it won't be making an actual difference in a presidential election, so that people know going forward what the rule ought to be.
Yeah, we should say that's the case that's being pursued by the law firm Jones Day. It's Alito, among others, has signaled an interest in it, and I think he asked that the ballots that fall into that special category be segregated, at least for now. And it is maybe a question the court would find jurisdictionally interesting, as opposed to dispositive of the election. And we should probably say that it's very distinct from that massive 105-page other thing, right? There's another Pennsylvania lawsuit that's alleging all kinds of fraud every which way.
Right. It's very distinct from that. This one is a real constitutional issue, and whether you agree or disagree with the people who filed the petition, the Republican Party of Pennsylvania, it still states an issue that we know is substantial, merely because we know that at least 3, possibly 4 justices have signaled that they are interested in it and think that there's something to decide there.
So probably the last question we'll have time for is kind of this doomsday scenario that isn't so much a court case, but some kind of effort to muddy the results enough so that state legislatures might feel as though they had the leeway to seat different electors than the ones that would have been specified by a specific result. This is a pretty scary scenario, although it involves an awful lot of people sacrificing their reputations to kind of jump on a live grenade. Maybe you can say a little bit more about how that looks to you.
Well, here's where just the preamble, I guess, to my comment is that we're all of us over the past week or two have experienced both the beauty of federalism and the nightmare of our federal system, where we have all these states with all of their own distinct election rules and different deadlines and things like that. And so what is going to happen is that all of these states have their own processes for determining the winner after the vote count of the popular vote, and then ascertaining and certifying it and saying, okay, our election goes to this candidate or that. And then at that point, after the certification, they have to appoint electors, state electors, presidential electors that will reflect that certification when they go and vote in the Electoral College. And at that point, it is possible for a state to say, well, because this election was fraudulent, the win was fraudulent, we will appoint electors who will not vote according to the popular vote result. Now, that is possible. I still do not think it's likely, but that is something that we are seeing people push for. We're seeing certain Republican figures saying that is something that states could do. And then go ahead.
Well, I think we are flat out of time. That's my fault too. But so we'll have to we'll have to leave us people with possible but not likely. Jeannie Suk Gersen, thank you so much for joining us today. Contributing writer to The New Yorker, professor at Harvard Law School. Thanks for joining us and for sharing your wisdom.
Thank you.